I'm going to cover a few topics in our chapter this week. So let's start with sensation and perception, some demonstrations and examples. So spell these words along with me, and I'm going to do this fairly fast. Spell poke. Okay, spell smoke. Smell joke. Smell woke. Now spell the white part of an egg. Okay, did I get you on the last one? Many of us, myself included, make that mistake. Okay, the last word you should have been spelled W-H-I-T-E. Now some of you might have spelled it Y-O-K-E, which is actually the incorrect spelling for the yellow part of an egg, which should be spelled Y-O-L-K. However, I didn't say spell the yellow part of an egg. I spelled white. Most of you, your hearing worked fine. It's your perception. Your brain turned it into something different because of what it was expecting. So usually this works well for us, but our brain sort of gets on a roll, used to certain kinds of things, and it processes information because we have so much to process that it does it fairly rapidly, organizes it, interprets it. That's the process of perception. Sensation is what our senses do. We take in that information, visual, hearing, touch, but our perception is a different process which allows us to analyze and interpret and make some meaning out of things, and then we act accordingly. Usually it works well, but in this case, demonstration, most of us got that wrong. If you got the W-H-I-T-E the first time correctly and you did it along with me, good for you, but there's nothing wrong with you if you made a mistake. We all make mistakes sometimes. Here's a couple of other examples here. There are different car models out there, as you know, Toyotas, Hondas, American cars, Fords, Oldsmobiles, whatever, Subarus. So each of them tends to have an insignia. There's an insignia. Now, don't look this up. I want you to write out what you think the insignia is for Kias. Kia and Hyundai are sort of the same Korean company, but Kia vehicles have a little insignia on the front and the back, and it has it at the dealership on their sign. And I want you to write out what you think that is. Now, I'm going to do this along with you. So you might think that's what it looks like, but no. And I thought so too. I've had Kia cars actually for quite a while, didn't notice it, and all of a sudden I said, wait a second, something's wrong with my perception. I just did something to it. Here's what it really looks like. And you can check this on the internet or on a vehicle if you go to a parking lot or drive by the Kia dealership on Stark Street close to the college. This is what it is, K-I and an upside down V. There's no line across, crossbar if you want to use sports terminology, for the Kia insignia. And we often miss that in our perception because our brain, again, is quickly organizing things because it works most of the time, and otherwise it would take way too long to process each individual little piece of the environment so that we could function in the world. One more example of errors. They tend to be fun, and they demonstrate how our perception process can work improperly. Of course, you could have a problem with your sensation, your vision and hearing, and if you get old enough like me, eventually that will happen. But we're talking about perception problems right now. We will talk about sensation. The chapter does the different parts, like the eye and the ear, that you'll be reading about. One more example. There used to be a sign east of Corvallis, between I-5 and Corvallis, where Oregon State University is, and I've driven by it a few times, and I made the mistake, and then once I realized it, I had somebody else in the car with me, same mistake. It's a big billboard, and it's advertising, and it looks like it's advertising a restaurant. It's got white and red checkerboard pattern on tablecloth, people eating food. It's got a big plate of pasta there, and at the very top, it says, legalize marinara. Legalize marinara. Okay, I read it incorrectly the first time. And then I noticed that difference. I said, wait a second, that picture has nothing to do with marijuana. And this was up there in the few years before we legalized recreational use of marijuana in Oregon. And so I'm in the car driving, and I have a passenger in the back, and I say, hey, could you read that sign? Why should I read it? Just read it. Read it. What does it say? Legalize marijuana. I say, look at it again. And so again, we make that mistake. That is sensation and perception, and some mistakes there and some of the differences there. Now we've got another topic, is thresholds. Thresholds, in the early days of studying sensation and perception, the early researchers studied what they called psychophysics, the psychological, behavioral, interpretive part, and the physics, which is the stimulus. The stimulus for sound and sight, it's a physical change in the environment, and our senses detect that. But again, our senses, at first they were just studying these thresholds, which is, do we detect something or not what kind of meaning we make out of it. It was more a matter of, can we perceive something or not? Such as when you take a hearing test. Very faint sound or very high or low pitched sound, do you detect it or not? So one type of threshold is called the absolute threshold. The absolute threshold is the very small amount of a stimulus that we can detect 50% of the time. Means that half the time we do perceive it, half the time we miss it, we don't, because it's just so small, either a sound that's so soft or a light that's so faint. For example, for most people, they have determined that an example of the absolute threshold for vision is a single candle flame on a dark night 30 miles away. Single candle flame on a dark night 30 miles away. That would be like in Beaverton. If we're standing in Gresham and pretend there's no fog, there's no hills, it's a clear dark night and nothing in the way, you could actually see that half the time, and half the time you wouldn't. I like the one for touch myself. Their example is a bee's wing falling onto your cheek, side, from 2 centimeters away. So barely an inch away. I think it's 1 or 2 centimeters away. So like an inch or less. A bee's wing falling onto your cheek. Half the time you're not going to detect it, half the time you will. So that's what we would call the absolute threshold 50% rule. 50% of the time we pick it up. If it's above 50%, like we detect it all the time, or 80% of the time, it's above that threshold. Below, less often, or not at all. Now, there's one more kind of threshold they talk about in the early days of studying sensation and perception was the difference threshold. Now, the difference between the difference and the absolute threshold is the difference threshold. We're talking about 2 things and deciding, is it 2 things or 1 thing, or are they the same or are they different? For example, let's say you're tuning a musical instrument and you're trying to make 2 notes be the same, or maybe there's 2 people playing guitars and one of them is trying to tune to the other to make sure they're in tune with each other, and you're listening with your ear. Well, as it gets really, really close, it becomes fairly hard to tell, is it different or is it the same? And when we can tell that there is a difference 50% of the time, but not more than that, that's called the difference threshold. Sometimes we have a word for this called the just noticeable difference, abbreviated in small letters, JND, just noticeable difference. This might apply also when we're trying to maybe touch up the wall. Let's say I've got a mark on the wall and I want to touch it up. I'm going to buy some paint or use a chip in the store, and then I come back and I paint over it. Can we detect that I've covered it a little bit with spackle and some little paint job? And was the paint close enough that it's below the difference threshold, that it's less than 50% of the time people can tell, oh, there's a difference between that part of the wall and the other part of the wall. That's the difference threshold. So the difference threshold means 2 stimuli. Are they the same or are they different? Absolute threshold is 1 stimulus. Is it there or is it not there? Now, when we talk about the absolute threshold, that brings to mind something a little bit more complex with our thinking that has to do with subliminal perception. Subliminal perception is the idea that something might be below the threshold of conscious perception and awareness, but it affects us anyways. I'll give you a little example here. One of my favorites. This is actually a copy of what I saw on a t-shirt once. So here's what it says. Okay. That's an example of something that may not be so subliminal, but first, if you take a quick look at it, it might be considered that. You could see that on somebody's shirt or on a piece of paper and miss the part that, again, it says good game, but no, somebody else there wasn't too happy about how the game went, apparently. The research evidence regarding subliminal perception says that it can affect our thoughts to some extent and our moods, but it doesn't affect our complex behavior. Subliminal perception doesn't make us do things and make choices out of our awareness that are more complex behaviors. So it's sort of mixed, and it goes against some of the thinking of advertisers in the past, where they would flash these words really fast at the movie theater and you couldn't see it because it was going too fast, but it was really there. If you slowed down the film processing, that it would make you thirsty, go buy popcorn, or spend more money at the concession stand. Not necessarily true or backed up by research. I may have a video for you to watch, an amusing SNL video on subliminal perception. We'll see. If not, you could search out them on your own. There's some funny, and they of course exaggerate what really can be accomplished, but it's amusing. Anyways, answer the question about this video. We'll see you next time.